Scenario 2, we've highlighted risk recovery and rights, and I think in this situation we can bring in the MCIT members as well. So really quickly, an individual who has active mental health symptoms living in shelters may spend extended periods sleeping rough or homeless. Due to repeated assaults, inappropriate exposure, in one instance, a fire setting, the individual is currently before the courts. He has been repeatedly found fit to stand trial and released on bail. His support team wants him in an inpatient unit to assess and treat, but he doesn't show behaviors while inpatient and is discharged quickly when informed. A push for a more thorough assessment of fitness could result in movement to the forensic mental health system, while the legal system may lead to incarceration or the revolving door of detention and bail. So we're looking, kind of the two questions we highlighted: what are the options for a challenging case like this? What are the legal and ethical considerations at play? And I guess maybe start by if this person is street involved or is showing active signs in the community, and the community members are calling the MCIT team, what might your response be to start? And then we'll move to the other panel members.
So in regards to police interaction, or specifically the mental health teams or the MCIT teams, when you're saying active, I'm assuming they're showing active signs of either psychosis or they're acting in a disorderly manner. So first and foremost, the officer will have to decide, is this person a danger to themselves or are they a danger to the public? In either case, then they have the authority to apprehend under the Mental Health Act, and specifically the Section 17 apprehension. And unfortunately, then that process starts where they're brought to a hospital for assessment. Once they're brought to the hospital for assessment, really the role of the police ends. If they are arrested and charged because, let's say, in the process they assault somebody, then the Criminal Investigative Bureau of the local division will determine what kind of conditions they would want the prosecutor and judge to put as conditions. And very often what will happen is that they'll ask for a hearing in front of the mental health court, or as commonly known, 102, 101 court down at Old City Hall. And some of those conditions will be to be assessed by the court-appointed psychiatrist. And in some cases, if we were to extend this scenario, that they may enter into a community treatment order at that point, where part of their conditions is that they agree to treatment. But that's typically what you would see. The MCIT wouldn't be involved unless there was a crisis component to it. It's always a crisis component.
And if he is before the courts, would they ask for feedback from your team in regards to what happens in court, or what the plea is, or what the...
Again, that will be a local decision made at the division, and the officer in charge of the case at the time, which would be a detective. And they may reach out, they may not. Typically, you won't see an MCIT officer doing the arrest. It usually will be another officer. Again, and the reason for that being is not that the officer isn't capable of doing the arrest. It's because the team's mandate is to be out on the road answering calls. So if I myself was on that team and I had to arrest someone, then that takes that team effectively off the road for a number of hours, because you have to bring the person in, you have to process them through the booking hall system, you have to do your notes, work on the case management of it, etc. So typically they wouldn't be involved in it. I'm not saying that they would not, but it's very low percentage of the time that the MCIT officer would be arresting someone. They would just be passed over to another primary response officer that would be attending with them.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I just want to kind of elaborate on this scenario, and I'm sure many of us are familiar with similar scenarios where an individual engages in some kind of disturbance in the community, has an interaction with police, and is then brought to the nearest ER. And I'm sure the frustration of a lot of individuals, the police, and community support staff is that the typical occurrence is that you're there, you wait around for a long time, somebody sees you really briefly and discharged, you're back walking down the street again, within several hours. I wonder if MCIT has encountered that, and whether you play a role in kind of encouraging more thorough assessments, or advocating for clients to have better reviews, or what is your experience with those kind of encounters?
And certainly that is a typical scenario, and certainly the teams will advocate for that, but ultimately the decision rests with the attending physician. The rule in the Mental Health Act, really all it does is authorize police to bring to a Schedule 1 psychiatric facility in the city of Toronto. That's usually a hospital. But ultimately, we will provide that collateral information, our observations, and we're really encouraging our officers to adopt the language that's being used in the medical field, really paint a picture of what they've seen, etc. But ultimately, the final decision is made by the physician whether they are to stay or not. And for all the reasons outlined by Kendra, right? And yes, it's difficult for officers sometimes to get their head around that concept because we clearly see this, et cetera, but, is it something that they're doing because it's a criminality to it? If it is a criminality to it, they are not going to be brought to the hospital. They're going to be arrested and brought before the courts. And then let the courts deal with the criminality component of it, and then the health system will take care of the mental health component of it. But if they are brought to the hospital and the doctor is the opinion that they are not formable, there's really not much we can do beyond that. That's just the way the system is at this point.
Thanks. So I just was gonna, just to bring it back to kind of, I know one of the challenges that we wanted to highlight in this example is the idea of forensic versus mental health, and if one benefits the other, and the ethics of looking at both of those. Can one guarantee, psychiatric oversight or some kind of inpatient? But then if you look at forensic, we know, especially for people with developmental disabilities, that can mean many years in a forensic hospital. So if anyone has kind of feedback or thoughts on kind of those two pathways. Kendra, were you gonna?
Yeah, so just picking up on the last point, I think August has really pinpointed a critical element of this cycling in and out of hospitals is a question of what information the hospital has when the person gets there. Because, somebody might, by the time they get to the emergency room and spend a night overnight, even just having meals and a shower and a bed can have a profound settling effect on somebody whose behaviors are much more erratic when they're out in the community. So it's critical that the inpatient team have the information, not just from the police about what they observed, but also any community teams, families, supports, so that they get a full sense of that overall picture. Certainly in Toronto, we have the benefit of a lot of hospitals and hopefully hospitals with good relationships with the police partners. So it's not uncommon for these cases where somebody's coming in and out of the emergency department very frequently, for hospitals to get together with the police and with community support agencies to talk about an individual and how can we fully support them. So are there court resources that we can leverage so that the next time this person ends up in court, they aren't necessarily just released on bail, but they might be sent to a diversion program where they can get more supports. Can we come up with a plan to look at what are all of the causes of this behavior and what different sectors can address those? So to the extent that there are active mental health symptoms, with a full picture, a hospital might be able to admit somebody for a longer period to get the mental health symptoms under control, but also how much of this behavior is driven by the lack of housing, and the person is on the street, which means maybe they're stealing things, or they need money, or they're using substances. So can we as a sector and as different organizations pull together to see if we can find this person housing and get their substance use addressed, or whatever other social factors might be contributing. This question of getting people into the forensic system, that's the system under the Ontario Review Board. It can be very beneficial for individuals because it tends to mean sort of sustained oversight where you don't run into these problems where they're not formable, or so the hospital can't do anything and there's no immediate crisis, so the police can't help and they're not cooperating in the community, so the community team has to sort of say, well, unless they're willing to talk to us, there's not much we can do. In the forensic system, there's a forced oversight, and so it can result in better outcomes in the long term and at least sustained. The difficulty is that entry into that system is completely dependent on what happens in court. which is completely dependent on how the Crown Attorney wants to proceed with the charges and how the person is being advised by their defense lawyer about what is in their sort of legal interests, not necessarily their overall best health interests. But again, I think sort of, everybody coming together and looking at what are all the different factors can be really helpful in informing those decisions. That gateway through the courts into the forensic system can often create a disconnect because, if the Crown is not interested in going the mental health route, or if an individual sees that they could get, 6 months on probation on a mischief charge, or could spend the next 5 years in a hospital, they might elect the 6 months on probation and then they wouldn't get into that forensic system. But I think the mental health courts, certainly in Toronto, is a really great resource to look at, even if somebody's not going into the forensic system, what mental health supports can be put into place in them, and community resources to help them get back on track.
Well, and I was going to say, we know that people that have any kind of cognitive compromise can either present as much higher functioning and more capable at times, or much lower, and it can really impact. I just want to do a shout out to the Service Resolution Project, and Rona's in the audience, who is what's your full title?
You almost said it.
Service Resolution Coordinator? Justice Coordinator. So if anyone has questions around the justice piece or around that project, Rona's a great resource. So.
And I just wanted to add that Toronto Police Service and Partner and Spider is part of this organization as our focus tables or situation tables, where this individual definitely meets the criteria for an acutely elevated risk. And the goal there is not case management, but maybe to bring them down to a manageable level, and then case management from there. Although it sounds just from the scenario that he is being case managed, but is going through an acutely elevated risk at this point, but it hasn't met that criteria where the MCIT would be involved, but it obviously needs more follow-up. And to me, something like this would be the situation tables, because they could bring that, bear all of that. With the 99 agencies that are involved, I'm sure that they could assist the agencies already involved.
Thanks. I think, we'll just do one more, and then we're going to kind of try and move on to the next one, but go ahead. Go ahead, Leah.
Okay. And I just wanted to add, so the Local Health Integration Network within Toronto has just recently released a community business intelligence tool, because one of the things that we do have a hard time with is tracking people who are in and out of hospitals, because we often can't see across the entire system. So we are working on that right now to try to get that information, and then we can track people who are kind of revolving through the system and do things like refer them to the focus tables and use that data a lot better. It's a new tool. We're really excited about it.
When you and I connect, can you share some of that info? That would be awesome.
Just, Kendra mentioned it briefly, but I wanted to highlight it given the composition of the audience. There are also systemic issues, and when you said that's just how the system is, and we all recognize the system is flawed and imperfect, and ethics requires us to look above the individual instances at systems as well. And when we think about it, so in this particular instance, and we like to often talk about social determinants of health, there's also social determinants of illness, in terms of the systems creating people. It's causing people to be ill because it's flawed. So in this instance, is this individual's behavior related to the fact that there isn't housing for this person, and the system hasn't seen fit to provide housing for this person, which exacerbates their underlying set of issues, and now they are a victim of the system and also victimizing others, perhaps in that instance. And so what is the obligation morally and ethically for the system to recognize itself and its contribution to the problem and fix it? All of us work in environments where we undergo continuous quality improvement. Does the system undergo continuous quality improvement when these things are highlighted? So what is the contributing factor of the system's flaws, limitations, and other issues that have brought this person to where they are and now are in the system at a different level? And so we need to think of the system at a higher level as sometimes being a contributing factor to the problem rather than the solver of the problem.